Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a topic that I think is incredibly relevant, especially in today's world. We're going to be talking about economic sanctions and really kind of uncovering the history behind them.
Yeah, it's something that we hear about all the time in the news, but, most people don't really know the kind of surprising origin story of this tool.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be basing our deep dive on a book called The Economic Weapon: The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War by Nicholas Mulder.
This book really challenges the common view that sanctions are, a modern invention.
Yeah, it seems like something that, just kind of came about in the 20th century or something.
Right, exactly. But Mulder actually traces them back centuries and shows how they've been intertwined with warfare itself, really.
So before we get into the details of the book itself, can you tell us a bit about Nicholas Mulder? I always like to know a little bit about the author, it kind of helps me contextualize their work.
Yeah, sure. So Mulder is a historian at Cornell University. He specializes in 20th century history. But his research on sanctions has really uncovered some incredible insights into the complexities of international relations, not just in the past, but also in the present.
All right, let's get into it then. One of the first things that jumped out at me in the book was how the meaning of the word sanction itself has changed over time. Imagine saying you sanction something that you approve of. It's kind of mind-boggling.
I know, right? It's almost the opposite of what it means today. But that shift in meaning really reflects, a deeper change in how the world worked. During the 19th century, global trade really exploded. And with this new interconnectedness came this idea that you could use economic exclusion as a way to enforce rules and punish transgressions.
So it's not just about like cutting off trade, it's about using economic power to shape behavior.
Exactly, yeah. And what's interesting is that this idea wasn't just theoretical. It was being put into practice even before the term sanction took on its modern meaning.
Right. And the book mentions this really interesting example. The Irish Land League in 1880, they used what we now call a boycott to pressure a land agent. And get this, the term boycott actually originated from this very event.
It's a great example of how this technique of like non-cooperation existed before it even had a name.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. But what's really intriguing is how perceptions of sanctions evolved, in the period between the two world wars. There's this common assumption that sanctions were seen as, an alternative to war.
Like a more humane way to resolve conflict.
Exactly,
Well,
exactly. But Mulder actually shows that during this time, sanctions were actually seen as a core part of total war, a weapon to be wielded alongside traditional military force. Like Woodrow Wilson even called boycotts a far more terrible instrument of war than traditional warfare.
wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think it really speaks to this growing recognition of the impact that economic warfare could have. It's not just about like military casualties, but it's about disrupting entire economies, creating hardship and really kind of undermining the social fabric of a nation.
So it's almost like he's saying that this economic weapon can inflict, deeper and more lasting wounds than bombs and bullets.
Yeah, and that's a really key theme that runs throughout Mulder's book. He really explores this tension between the perceived effectiveness of sanctions and their potential to cause, unintended consequences.
Right. And that's something that, we see play out throughout history, right?
Exactly.
Now, the book delves into the role of the League of Nations, the international organization founded after World War I, right?
Right.
And how they shaped this early history of sanctions. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the League of Nations, they had this vision of using sanctions as a tool for peacekeeping, especially in Europe. They believed that the threat of economic isolation could deter aggression and maintain international order.
It sounds like a very noble idea, but in practice, I imagine it was incredibly complex.
Oh, absolutely. There was this inherent tension in their vision, right? Like, could the economic weapon really be impartial? Or would it inevitably be used to target specific threats based on political considerations? And this dilemma really shaped the entire history of sanctions between the wars.
And it's a dilemma that I think still resonates today, right?
Absolutely. But, to really grasp the complexities of this early period, it's helpful to look at a specific example. And Mulder actually takes us on this journey following a shipment of manganese ore from a mine in Brazil all the way to Germany during World War I.
Oh, yeah, this was a fascinating section. It got a little technical with like bills of exchange and Deutsche Bank and all these like intricate financial
Yeah,
mechanisms.
it does, yeah.
Um,
But the key takeaway really is that even during wartime, global trade and finance remained deeply interconnected. And this created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, right? But it also made it really difficult to completely isolate a country economically.
So even in the midst of this like global conflict, there were these intricate networks of trade and finance operating in the background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, too, is that even some proponents of free trade, like Lord Robert Cecil, were strong advocates for economic warfare.
That seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It might seem that way on the surface, but it actually reflects their belief in the power of economic interdependence.
Yeah.
They saw manipulating trade as a way to influence the behavior of nations, to like incentivize cooperation and deter aggression.
So they believe that, like, economic ties could be a force for peace, but also a weapon to be wielded when necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this thinking was really heavily influenced by the experience of World War I. The success of the Allied blockade of Germany convinced many that economic warfare could be a decisive factor in winning a conflict.
Right. And there's a striking quote in the book from Alfred Zimmern, who was working in the British Foreign Office at the time. And he calls the economic weapon the most powerful in the varied armory of the Allies.
Yeah, that really captures the shifting perceptions of economic warfare in the aftermath of World War I.
It seems like there was this growing belief that if sanctions had been available in 1914, they could have prevented the war altogether.
It's a tantalizing thought, but as Mulder shows, the history of sanctions is far more complicated than that.
In a history that is full of unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll delve into further, in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how those hopes and anxieties surrounding the economic weapon played out in the years between the wars.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So yeah, picking up where we left off, that period between the two world wars, it was a time of, intense debate and experimentation with this idea of the economic weapon.
Right. There was that hope that sanctions could be this tool for preventing future wars. But at the same time, there was this growing anxiety about, their potential for abuse, right?
Yeah.
And for causing all sorts of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is where the story of the League of Nations gets really interesting, right? They were tasked with actually putting this idea of sanctions as a peacekeeping tool into practice.
Right. They had this big responsibility
Yeah.
to actually make it work. But it seems like they faced some pretty serious challenges.
It did, yeah. One of the biggest challenges was this inherent tension, right, between the desire for impartiality, wanting to be fair, and the need to target specific threats.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's tricky. Like, could this economic weapon truly be used in like a neutral way? Or would it always just be subject to, political maneuvering? Like whoever's got the most power gets to decide.
Exactly, yeah. And this dilemma played out in a number of cases that Mulder examines in the book. For instance, there was a lot of debate about the legality and morality of using a blockade against Soviet Russia after World War I.
Oh, yeah, even though there wasn't like an official declaration of war.
Right, exactly.
I remember reading about that. There were groups like the Union for Democratic Control,
Yeah.
and they argued that those actions were undermining, democratic principles and international law. It's like they were worried about economic warfare being used as a tool of aggression rather than a means of upholding peace.
Yeah, and their concerns were valid. I mean, this debate about the limits of economic coercion, it's still relevant today.
For sure.
But despite all these challenges, the League of Nations did try to codify the use of sanctions in its charter.
Okay, so like make some rules, some guidelines.
Exactly. So Article 16 of the Covenant, which dealt with sanctions, it was the result of these complex negotiations and compromises between different nations.
It was a bold attempt, to try to create this system of collective security. But as we know, it ultimately failed to prevent World War II.
It did, yeah. And Mulder argues that the League's experience with sanctions offers some valuable lessons about the limitations of economic warfare. One of the key takeaways, I think, is that sanctions often have unintended consequences.
Right, and that's a point you've made before, and it seems to be like a recurring theme throughout the book. Can you give us some specific examples of those unintended consequences?
Sure. One example is the League's sanctions against Italy in 1935 for its invasion of Ethiopia.
Right.
These sanctions were ultimately unsuccessful in halting the Italian advance, but they did have a profound impact on how countries thought about economic warfare.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, they highlighted the difficulty of achieving international cooperation. The sanctions were hampered by resistance from neutral countries and the lack of participation by the United States, which wasn't a member of the League at the time.
Right, yeah. So even if there's a broad consensus that a country's acting aggressively, there's no guarantee that sanctions will be implemented effectively.
Exactly, yeah. And even if they are implemented, there's no guarantee that they'll achieve their intended goals. In the case of Italy, the sanctions may have actually backfired by pushing Mussolini to pursue autarky even more vigorously.
Autarky. That's the term for economic self-sufficiency, right?
Right.
It seems counterintuitive that sanctions, which are designed to isolate a country economically, could actually make it more determined to go it alone.
It does, yeah. But it's a pattern that we see repeatedly throughout history. When countries feel threatened by economic isolation, they often double down on efforts to become self-sufficient. And this can actually make them more resilient to sanctions in the long run.
So rather than forcing a change of behavior, sanctions can sometimes have the opposite effect. Like strengthening the resolve of the target country and making it even more difficult to influence their actions.
Exactly. And this is one of the key insights that Mulder brings to the table, I think. He forces us to confront these complexities and unintended consequences of economic warfare. It's not as simple as just saying, we're going to punish this country by cutting off trade.
It gets messy, yeah. I remember this part of the book where Mulder really gets into the anxieties of the time. Like he talks about how this fear of sanctions, it actually drove countries to pursue autarky even more vigorously.
Absolutely, yeah. It's this vicious cycle, right? Countries feared being cut off from vital resources, so they tried to become less reliant on international trade. But by doing so, they often became more isolated, which then made them more likely to resort to aggression to get what they needed.
Right, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key concept that Mulder highlights, the rise of synthetic fuel production.
Oh yeah, right. That was a major part of Germany's drive for autarky, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Germany was developing ways to produce synthetic fuel from coal so that they wouldn't be as reliant on imported oil. And this wasn't just driven by economic considerations. It was fueled by this fear that they could be targeted by oil sanctions in a future conflict.
So these fears of economic warfare were actually shaping technological development,
Oh.
and influencing strategic decision-making at the highest levels.
Precisely, yeah. And it's not just about Germany. Mulder shows how this dynamic played out in other countries as well. The fear of sanctions became this really powerful, motivating factor in economic and political calculations around the world.
Wow. It's fascinating how this seemingly technical aspect of economic warfare has such profound geopolitical implications. It really highlights this interconnectedness of economics and politics on a global scale.
And that interconnectedness becomes even more apparent when we look at the outbreak of World War II. The conflict really marked a turning point in how economic warfare was waged. It shifted the focus from using sanctions to prevent war to using them as a tool of war itself.
The U.S. Lend-Lease program is a prime example of this shift, right?
Hmm.
It showed how economic power could be used to, support allies and bolster war efforts.
Exactly. Lend-Lease was a game changer. It provided billions of dollars worth of aid to countries fighting against the Axis powers, demonstrating how economic assistance could be just as powerful as economic coercion in shaping the outcome of a conflict.
It also kind of blurred the lines between aid and warfare, right? It's like
Yeah.
it highlighted the fact that economic power could be used in a variety of ways, depending on the strategic context.
Right, exactly. And this blurring of lines continued in the post-war era with the establishment of the United Nations and the emergence of the Cold War.
So the legacy of the League of Nations, both its successes and its failures, it kind of casts this long shadow over the development of the UN sanctions regime. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, so the architects of the UN, they were acutely aware of the challenges the League had faced in enforcing sanctions. They were determined to create a more robust and effective system. But they also had to contend with the realities of a world that was now divided by, this ideological rivalry.
Right, the Cold War. That must have made it incredibly difficult to achieve the kind of international cooperation needed for sanctions to be effective.
It did, yeah. The Security Council, which is responsible for authorizing sanctions, was often paralyzed by vetoes from the U.S. or the Soviet Union. And this made it very difficult to reach consensus on the use of sanctions, especially in cases where the superpowers had conflicting interests.
So despite those hopes that the UN would, usher in this new era of collective security, the Cold War created a very different set of challenges for the international community. And sanctions remained, a controversial and often ineffective tool of statecraft.
Yeah, that's a good assessment. But the story of sanctions doesn't end with the Cold War. In fact, as Mulder argues, they've become even more prominent in the post-Cold War world.
Oh, wow. That's a surprising twist. You'd think with the collapse of the Soviet Union and all this talk of a, new world order, that sanctions might have become less relevant.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the reality is that sanctions have actually proliferated in recent decades. They've become this go-to tool for a variety of actors, not just states, to try to influence behavior and achieve foreign policy goals.
That's something we'll definitely have to delve into in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore how sanctions have evolved in the post-Cold War era and what challenges they pose for the future of international relations.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Okay, so we've been talking about this evolution of economic sanctions, from their early origins to their, kind of controversial role in the 20th century. But now let's shift our focus to this post-Cold War era. You mentioned that sanctions have actually become even more prominent in recent decades. Like, why is that?
Well, I think one of the key factors is the rise of the U.S. as the sole superpower, after the end of the Cold War. Sanctions became a key tool in its foreign policy arsenal, a way to project its power and influence around the world without necessarily resorting to military intervention.
So it's like a way for the U.S. to try to, enforce its will on the global stage without actually having to send in troops.
Right, exactly. But this raises some important questions, right? About the legitimacy and effectiveness of sanctions in a world where power is more, diffuse. It's not just about one superpower calling the shots anymore.
Right, and we've seen that play out in recent years, with the rise of new powers like China and, there's this growing pushback against U.S. dominance.
Absolutely. And that's why Mulder argues that the future of sanctions is uncertain. They might have been a powerful tool in the past, but their effectiveness is increasingly in doubt.
He even suggests that sanctions could backfire.
Yep.
That they could actually strengthen the resolve of target countries or even push them closer to rivals of the U.S.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of that, haven't we? Sanctions against countries like Iran and Venezuela, they haven't really achieved their stated goals. And in some cases, they may have even had the opposite effect, strengthening the regimes they were intended to weaken.
Mulder's book doesn't really offer any easy answers, does it?
Yeah.
It seems like it's more about, raising these tough questions and challenging our assumptions about how economic power works in the world.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a book that invites us to think critically about sanctions, to weigh the costs and benefits and to consider the often unintended consequences.
One of the things that really struck me was his discussion of the ethical dilemmas of sanctions. How do we reconcile the goals of economic pressure with the humanitarian impact on civilian populations?
Yeah, that's a tension that's been present throughout the history of sanctions, but it's become even more acute in recent years, as sanctions have become more widespread and targeted.
So how do we grapple with these ethical challenges? What does Mulder suggest?
Well, he argues that we need to move beyond this simplistic view of sanctions, as either a tool of punishment or a tool of coercion. We need to start thinking about them as part of a broader spectrum of economic statecraft.
So not just about, wielding this economic weapon, but also about using economic incentives, building partnerships, and promoting economic development as a way to influence behavior and achieve, foreign policy goals.
Exactly, yeah. It's about using economic power in a more strategic and responsible way, recognizing that sanctions are a blunt instrument that can have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences.
I think this deep dive into the economic weapon has been incredibly insightful. It's really challenged our understanding of sanctions, their history, their evolution, and their impact on the world.
Right.
And I especially appreciated how Mulder connects this rich historical narrative to the challenges we face today.
It's what makes this book so compelling, right? It's not just a history lesson. It's a lens through which we can better understand the complexities of economic power and its role in shaping global affairs.
I have to say, I had some initial reservations about, diving into a book on economic sanctions. I thought it might be kind of dry or overly technical. But Mulder's writing is, it's engaging. It's accessible, even for someone like me who's not an economist or a historian.
Yeah, he does a great job of weaving together, historical narratives, economic analysis, and political insights. And he also doesn't shy away from the ethical complexities of the subject, which makes it all the more thought-provoking.
And there's been a lot of praise for this book, right? It won the Longman History Today Book of the Year prize, and it was named one of the best books of the year by The Economist, The Financial Times, and Foreign Affairs, among others. But I know there has also been some criticisms.
Yeah, some critics argue that Mulder gives too much agency to the idea of sanctions themselves, almost as if they operate independently of the political context in which they're deployed.
So they're saying that he may overstate the causal relationship between sanctions and, historical outcomes.
Yes, they argue that sanctions are just one tool among many and that their effectiveness is always dependent on a complex interplay of factors.
Right? It's a reminder that history is rarely, a simple cause and effect story. But even with those critiques, I still think this book is an essential read for anyone who wants to understand, the use and abuse of economic power in the world today.
I couldn't agree more. It's a book that'll stay with you long after you finish reading it.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into The Economic Weapon by Nicholas Mulder. I encourage you to check it out for yourself and, explore this fascinating and often troubling history of economic sanctions.